And when it comes to human rights as well, the whole point of human rights is they're inviolable and inalienable. So there are rights that cannot be signed away. If a contract involves the signing away of human rights, it is not a valid contract. Human rights, that they're not trophies that you can collect or give away. You know, they are, the whole point is, even if you wish to separate yourself from those rights, you cannot do so.
Today on Brave New Us, I'm here with Fiorella Nash, author of The Abolition of Woman: How Radical Feminism is Betraying Women. Fiorella, welcome to Brave New Us.
It's lovely to meet you at last. Almost in person.
Almost.
Almost.
How did you first become interested in life issues from a feminist perspective, and what led you to write The Abolition of Woman?
Well, it's been quite a long journey. I certainly did not initially see myself as a feminist. As a teenager, I completely rejected feminism. I thought it was just old ladies whinging about grass
Interesting.
ceilings.
Usually it goes the other way.
Yeah, it's funny, it went completely the other way with me. I thought this is ridiculous. They're fighting. It just seemed very petty. It seemed like they were fighting yesterday's battles. You know, we had in the 80s. You know, we had Margaret Thatcher. You know, whatever you thought of her, she was a strong woman. You know,
Right.
I didn't really even see why feminism was necessary. I came to see things very differently in the years that followed, and a big turning point for me was I wrote an article which I lived to regret somewhat, talking about why I hated feminism, why I thought it was a load of rubbish and women should really move on. And somebody wrote me a response, and they just sent me a book called Swimming Against the Tide, pro-life feminist essays. And it just had a post-it note on the front saying, pro-life feminism does exist, underlined. And it started me on this journey looking at groups like Feminists for Life of America and other groups, Women's Forum Australia, and it gave me a completely different perspective on abortion from a feminist point of view. I started to see more of what early feminism was like, the history of feminism and previous attitudes to marriage and family life, which was very, very different to the understanding of feminism that I had grown up with. And it was just a huge game changer for me, and it gave me the opportunity to start looking at how abortion exploits women, just looking way beyond the narrative at this very different way of looking at abortion. And I got the opportunity, I was working for a group called SPUC, the Society for the Protection of Unborn Children. I got the opportunity to do a lot of talks in universities and conferences, got a lot of feedback, a lot of debate going, and really the book kind of flowed from there.
Wow, great. Well, in your book, you point out that while radical feminism has denigrated motherhood for decades, big fertility denigrates motherhood far more than feminism ever did. And it is, in fact, often the feminists who are saying so. So how do egg donation and surrogacy denigrate motherhood?
Well, it is interesting that feminism seems to be waking up to this. You see women like Germaine Greer, for example, talking very vociferously about just what it means for a woman to have her eggs extracted and to go through that process. And it's ironic in some respects that artificial reproductive technologies have stolen or have tried to steal motherhood from women. And it does interest me that, having denigrated motherhood for so many decades, that women are maybe, feminism is maybe waking up to the fact that the fertility industry is hurting women in this way. And it's hard to know almost where to start, but the whole process, even the language surrounding egg donation, is very anti-women. I don't even like the term donation. In fact, I'm using it for want of a better word, but it seems to me it's a very poor term even in itself. I'll maybe talk about that a bit more later. But surrogates get called genetic carriers or gestational carriers when we're talking about mothers. We're reducing a woman's body to a kind of incubator or a vessel to gestate somebody else's baby, when the woman's body is so much more than that. Pregnancy is so much more than that. And if you think about how it involves a symbiotic relationship between a mother and child, it's so significant for both mother and child. Reducing it through surrogacy to a kind of biological process means ignoring all of that, ignoring that bond that develops between mother and baby, the significance of those 9 months of pregnancy. In many cases, women seeking IVF, as we call it here, or ART, have no idea even why they are struggling with their fertility. Women are kept in the dark, unlike NAPRO technology, for example, which takes a very different view of fertility. It seeks to work with women's fertility, with women's bodies. ART leaves women in the dark about the nature of their problem. It offers very little in the way of emotional support. And that's, of course, before we even go on to how dangerous the whole procedure can be for women.
Right. So when you say you're not sure that donation is the correct word, what do you think that we should be calling it when we give away our sperm or eggs?
It's a difficult one, because donation, it sort of makes it sound like blood donation, or something so fairly straightforward and painless that doesn't make any kind of an impact on a woman's life. But in reality, what happens when you provide an egg, I'm trying to find a different way of putting it.
Right.
It's difficult. Is you are taking part in an act of creation. You know, when a woman gives an egg, a man gives sperm. Out there may be their biological child. They are becoming a mother or a father. It's a hugely significant act, and one that can have will have lifelong consequences for all sorts of people. So what do we say instead of donation? I don't want to say egg provider either. There's no easy way of saying what it should be, really, because it's really a process that should not happen.
We don't have a word for this because it's something that has never really been possible in this way before.
No, it's something that is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. You know, one generation isn't that long. And I think the fact that the language is struggling to make sense of the process is a sign that deep down there is something unsettling about this. There's something that just doesn't feel completely correct about what we're doing. And in some ways, it almost feels like an attempt to take away the gravity of what we're doing.
Definitely. And so you mentioned, surrogates are being referred to as things like gestational carriers. Sometimes they're eliminated or erased from the official paperwork altogether. Why does the language that we use to talk about these roles matter so much?
It is so significant. It's the fact is that words matter, words are important. And I certainly noticed this working in the pro-life movement, looking at abortion, the tendency to talk about the products of conception and the contents of the uterus, an attempt to soften the reality of what actually goes on in an abortion. And we are in danger of doing the same thing, in the same way that abortion erases the baby by just refusing to use the word. ART can in some ways risk erasing the mother by not mentioning what it is. There is no such thing as a gestational carrier. That is a mother. There's no way of getting around that. That is what it means to be pregnant. It is to be a parent. It is to be a mother. And I find it ironic that we're so quick to treat women as kind of human incubators when it comes to surrogacy, when the very people who support surrogacy usually also complain that abortion has to be available to stop women being treated like human incubators. Right. We have to, we've got to be realistic about what it means to be a surrogate. It's motherhood, and there are good reasons why many countries that allow surrogacy cite the surrogate mother as the birth mother. That's not the case in all countries, but it's because we know that when a woman is pregnant, she and the baby will bond. whether she intends that to happen or not. There are all sorts of processes that happen to ensure that that connection is made for obvious evolutionary reasons. And that is why it's not unusual for a pregnant woman to change her mind about adoption. A lot of women who claim that they will put up a baby for adoption change their mind after birth because they suddenly discover there's this connection that they can't and don't want to break. And that is why sometimes surrogate mothers will refuse to give up a baby. You know, we've got to stop manipulating language to get away from the reality of what we're doing.
Yeah, some of those conflicts when either that happen after birth, like you mentioned, or even before birth, when there's a dispute about the product that's being created and somebody, one or the other, wants an abortion, usually, well, it just can get pretty messy.
Yeah, and it's extremely distressing when it happens. I mean, it has to be borne in mind as well that the very term IVF, in vitro fertilization, I'm actually quoting a feminist here, I quote it in my book, actually refers to the only part of the entire process that doesn't involve a woman's body. It gives the impression that a baby is grown in a test tube. I mean, even the term test tube babies, it's not used quite so much as it used to be. The fact that the overwhelming majority of the pregnancy occurs in a woman's body and involves a woman is completely erased from the title.
No, that's interesting. I wonder if they'll come up with a different term altogether when and if they develop the technology further to use artificial wombs, take the baby straight from the in vitro situation into the artificial womb. Are we going to call that a gestational carrier? Certainly that's not a mother.
Yeah.
But what terms are we using that would differentiate the human woman who is caring for this child from the incubator?
Yes, I mean, interestingly, the whole artificial womb scenario, it feels so like Huxley's Brave New World. It's almost head spins trying to get around it. Ironically, when one looks at these dystopian novels like Brave New World, which imagined a world of completely artificial reproduction, the one big mistake Huxley made is that it doesn't have to be mechanized. There will always be women in certain situations who can be exploited into being the surrogates for other people's children.
Right.
That human reality is unlikely to change.
Yeah, in some ways, maybe that's even more dystopian than treating human beings as mechanical devices is maybe more dystopian than growing them in them.
Yeah, well, of course, we have, say, a dystopian novel like Handmaid's Tale, which has been hugely influential. And, I know there are groups in the US who dress up in the white bonnets and the red dresses and as a nod to Margaret Atwood's book. And the point I try to make is we have created the world of The Handmaid's Tale. Never mind, we might. I mean, Margaret Atwood said, that it's all too likely it might happen. It is happening.
Right.
It's just that the handmaids are generally not white. They're poor women from developing countries. So for some reason, we don't seem to think this is much of a problem. There's an inherent racism at work there as well, because I can't help feeling that if commercial surrogacy on the scale that you see in some developing countries were happening in America, dormitory style buildings and women, incarcerated and not allowed to see their families and given a battery of drugs every day. If we were doing that to American women or British women, I think perhaps we'd have a problem with it.
Yeah, I think you're right.
Possibly.
I would hope.
I hope so.
We'd have a problem with it either way. I think maybe that's the power of images, right? The way we don't see that, it's not in front of our faces, and in the history of the many injustices that we've committed in society throughout the years, it is having those images first and foremost that has helped social change. So hopefully we can have some good solid documentaries, some images coming forward into the mind of the public to be able to see what really is happening.
I mean, we're seeing there are a few documentaries out there finally. If you look at the mainstream media tends to cover surrogacy in entirely a positive way. When they do documentaries, there was a big documentary some years ago about India before they changed the law, and you see smiling women in saris giving up their baby. There were some distressing moments, but the whole thing is portrayed in a very sanitized way. You are starting to see other documentaries coming out, like Exploitation, for example, where they interview women whose health has been damaged by egg donation and surrogacy, but they struggle to get themselves out there. But yes, as you say, we need those images. We need those women's voices.
Yeah. So there is one quote that I want to read out verbatim, and that is, this is from chapter, oh, I'm blanking on the chapter number, but this is from your book directly. And you say, in IVF, the male's contribution invariably involves masturbating into a container with the assistance of pornographic materials that objectify and degrade women. Even the male act in IVF is anti-woman.
Yeah.
Wow. That quote in itself is so powerful. What are some other ways that artificial reproductive technology is anti-woman?
Well, I mean, gosh, where to start? I mean, I made that rather cheeky reference to what men have to do, because that is literally the sum total of what a man has to do in that situation, whereas women have to go through the whole process. And I think there's very little understanding about exactly what it involves. So the woman will have to take hormone injections, which can have very unpleasant side effects, egg harvesting, which again has some risks associated, particularly hyperstimulation of the ovaries, we know is a problem, and the very likely scenario of not taking home a baby at the end, of going through miscarriage, of early pregnancy loss, or just complete ART failure. And it's emotionally, physically a terrible ordeal to put a woman through. And there's virtually, in fact, there are no longitudinal studies, as far as I'm aware. I did really look about the long-term effects of, on women's health of ART. And it does mean that a clinic can say, as far as we know, this is not risky for women, but that's because they haven't asked.
As far as we know, because we haven't studied this.
And because we're resisting actually asking the question. There is a lot of clinical suspicion about long-term risks of certain cancers, for example, breast cancer, of long-term fertility problems for egg donors in particular. And yet the studies have not been carried out. And I've sometimes, when I've been speaking to, say, a medical group, I've asked, how many of you are doctors? How many of you would give a medical treatment to a woman without having a clue if it may harm her? How many of you would be prepared to wager a woman's health on something that may or may not hurt her? And you almost unanimously were saying, no way, no, I'd never do that. Why would I do that? I mean, there's the Hippocratic Oath, I'm supposed to look after my patient. And yet that is what we are doing. So I also think this is a painful aspect of the exploitative nature of ART, is that all the advertising, all the material, you see lots of lovely pictures of babies, you see lots of lovely pictures of mothers with babies, and women are given very unrealistic expectations about the likelihood of a good outcome. In fact, the success rates for IVF are quite poor, and even the statistics we have tend to focus on women in their 20s and 30s rather than the whole spectrum of age, which of course brings the numbers down. And as you say, you mentioned earlier, the heartache, where things can get messy, things can get complicated. For every healthy baby born, there are thousands of embryos that perish, that are left in stasis. You get, in some cases, terrible court cases. There was a case here in Britain some years ago where a couple decided to have IVF. They froze embryos, and then the man walked out of the relationship and he withdrew his consent for the embryos to be implanted. And in Britain, there has to be consent from both parents. And she fought right the way to the European Court of Human Rights. She lost her case and the embryos were destroyed. And it did create some comment about what that woman went through, because a man decided to withdraw his signature for quite possibly rather malicious reasons. Possibly, let's give humanity the benefit of the doubt. But it very quickly, the conversation moved on. And that tends to be, whenever anything goes wrong in ART, it tends to be, just move the conversation on. Let's dwell on this.
Right. Yeah,
Let's let women think about it.
Recently, there was a woman who, in California, she was a surrogate for a gay couple, and it was discovered through the course of her treatment that she had cancer and she needed to begin her cancer treatments. And she was all in on carrying the baby as far as she could, and giving up, some of her time of having those cancer treatments. And she was going to wait, I think, until 34 weeks. But the fathers, as she said, they wanted a death certificate. They wanted the babies aborted and born so that, or not born, but aborted so that they could have erased that, because they did not want to have to deal with any of the effects of children born before 34 weeks, which there are so many children born.
Yeah, I mean, that's not even regarded as particularly early. I mean, it's premature, but these days, 34 weeks. I very nearly gave birth at 29 weeks. I was told it would be okay. Right. But that sort of situation where a commissioning couple can just say, "Well, get rid of it." In some countries, women have no choice. Even if they are against abortion, they may be forced to go through that. I came across cases, it really shocked me, just the dark underworld of commercial surrogacy, cases of women who were given abortion pills without their knowledge. In these baby-making facilities, women are given drugs every day, vitamin supplements and all sorts of things, and most of the time they have no idea what they're being given, so it's relatively easy to slip abortion pills into their battery of tablets. And then when they aborted, they'd be told, "Oh, sorry, you suffered a miscarriage. Oh, we won't pay you. We won't pay you the full fee because you didn't carry to term." And it shows absolutely no regard for the rights of the woman in that case, for the right of a woman to follow her own conscience. To be forced to have an abortion, it is regarded through Nuremberg as a crime against humanity, forced abortion. And yet we have surrogacy agreements where women can be forced to abort a baby.
Just sign away those rights. So tragic.
And when it comes to human rights as well, the whole point of human rights is they're inviolable and inalienable. So there are rights that cannot be signed away. If a contract involves the signing away of human rights, it is not a valid contract. And human rights, that they're not trophies that you can collect or give away. They are, the whole point is, even if you wish to separate yourself from those rights, you cannot do so.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back, you mentioned a few of these already. I think ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome is one of them, but are there some other risks of egg donation and surrogacy, either to the mother or to the intended children, that you're aware of?
I'm not aware of the potential impact on children. The difficulty is, of course, that so many embryos don't establish themselves, that it can be difficult to know why that happened, whether that was just the process or whether there was something that happened beforehand. As I mentioned before, there is a lot of clinical suspicion about cancer risks, for example, stroke risk in some cases. The documentary Exploitation interviewed women who had developed life-limiting conditions as a result of egg donation. Quite often they were students who just thought, well, I'll do an egg donation, pay my way through university, who then became very ill. And it was noticed that with younger women with breast cancer, particularly in their 20s and 30s, they've almost always done egg donation or IVF in one level or other. So there's a lot of suspicion, but it's very hazy because there is just a lack of will to really explore this.
So what would you say then? Because at this point, I think clinics are anxious to get their hands on these biological products, and they're telling women, hey, you can use the money from freezing your eggs. You freeze, from donating your eggs, you can freeze your eggs with us. And then if you have problems later, you can come on back and you'll have already preserved your fertility. What would you say to women who are seeing those ads and considering some kind of process like that, or just freezing their eggs for the purposes of, just in case?
I would say, please don't do it. I would really advise women who are considering this to look at material beyond what the clinics are offering. And it depends in many ways why a woman is considering that. If it's because of fertility concerns, then there are alternatives, for example, NAPRO technology, which has a better success rate than ART and it takes a completely holistic approach to women's health. It's completely safe, it's completely ethical, it looks after women and looks after couples, I should say. If it's to do with a fear about missing the boat, for example, some women are encouraged to freeze their eggs so that they can cap their career with a baby. There are reasons why your fertility starts to wind down in your 40s. And we should perhaps, rather than trying to cheat our own biological clocks, just try and work with them a little more. It's controversial to say that now, but there are reasons why these processes happen.
No, I think that's a good point, and we should be saying that more, because what does it say about us when the thing that we are willing to put on hold is our relationships, our children, our families? Because you can't actually, you're, like you said, there are things you can't put on hold. What you're doing is you're postponing it, and you're just limiting the number of years, because we don't live forever. So you're limiting the number of years you have with your children. You're limiting the number of years you have, God willing, with your grandchildren. And so that's the trade-off. It gives the illusion, I think, of being able to delay this part of your life, but delaying is really just sacrificing that part of your life. And for what? For the career. And is that really the kind of society and the kind of goals that we want to be prizing, perhaps?
Yes, and I think there's a need more broadly to look at the sort of workplace environment in which women are working, because in a truly equal society, a woman shouldn't feel she has to postpone motherhood. Now, in Britain, there are employment laws that are quite generous, not as generous as they should be, but which offer maternity leave, now parental leave. Men can also take paternity leave after the birth of a baby. It is completely illegal in this country to fire a woman because she is pregnant or to prejudice her work in any way for that reason. Unfortunately, a lot of companies do discriminate against pregnant women because they know that most women in that situation are not going to want to fight a tribunal case.
Right.
So there needs to be a lot more support for women in the workplace. There needs to be a lot more education of employers that, a mother is not going to be a bad worker. The chances are she's going to be very motivated.
Right. When you're not just working for yourself,
exactly.
Motivation goes up.
Yeah, there still is an inherent, I think, belief that having a baby is a hindrance, that she's going to have her mind elsewhere, she's not going to want to do those extra hours or whatever. But there needs to be quite a big sea change, I think, even in employment law, really right around the world, to make sure that women do not feel pressured in that way to postpone motherhood. When, as you say, why postpone your own relationships? Why postpone your family life? Because it means postponing everything. As you say, it means maybe not being able to enjoy your grandchildren. I'm very aware that because my husband's parents married very young and had children young, and I married young and had children young, that my children knew their great grandparents. They had that connection. They met people. They met people who fought in the Second World War. They had a sense of their own history that many children today don't have, for exactly that reason.
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful to think about. So circling back to, you mentioned the Indian government had banned fertility tourism to keep foreigners from exploiting its citizens. Countries like Britain, Canada, Australia, France, Germany all have surrogacy bans to some degree or another. on the flip side, my home state of Idaho recently passed legislation that essentially encourages fertility tourism. Why is surrogacy inherently exploitative, and why should it be prohibited?
Well, I think the first thing I would say is I do not deny at all that there are some women who, for completely altruistic reasons, do offer to become surrogates. I've had women, when I've been given talks, stand up and say, oh, I loved being pregnant, I wouldn't mind going through that for a childless couple. Views tend to change quite quickly when we start talking about the difficulties, the ethical and the physical difficulties. However, with commercial surrogacy, it is completely exploitative in every sense of the word. It's not without reason that it is banned in many countries on the grounds that the human body is not for sale, that it should not be bought, sold, or rented out. Because when we go down the road of seeing the human body as subject to transaction, we are perilously close to endorsing a form of slavery. So that, there are reasons. It interested me seeing the wording, the original wording of the German prohibition on commercial surrogacy, because of course Germany, with its history, is very sensitive to anything that seems to be exploiting human life.
Right.
And one of the reasons why commercial surrogacy tends to flourish in developing countries is that you have a significant proportion of the population living in poverty. And the poverty trap is used to exploit women in this way. And it is a poverty trap. There was one surrogate in India who I quote in Abolition of Women, who told researchers that what other than poverty could possibly drive a woman to do this? Taking a battery of drugs on a daily basis, being separated from family and other children, having movements restricted, being kept under constant observation, and having your baby taken away from you the moment you deliver. Who would do that out of anything other than desperation? So commercial surrogacy can render a woman entirely helpless, just placing her at the mercy of agents and doctors who may not regard her needs as important. I've talked about women being given abortion pills. In many cases, you'll have women signing contracts in languages they can't even read, signing away rights without even knowing that they're doing it. This is just exploitation. It seems to me it's hardly a debate. It's so abundantly clear that commercial surrogacy is hurting women in these countries. I think we just choose not to see it that way because it's convenient.
Yeah. Well, so what about somebody says, okay, I concede that point. We need to change things. We need to fix the exploitation there. But that's not the same problem we're seeing here. That's not the same problem we're seeing in developed countries. Women in developed countries have the protection of their rights and things like that. They have access to legal recourse if the contract is subpar. What would you say to that about commercial surrogacy in those instances?
Well, even with safeguards, as we know from the abortion debate and the euthanasia debate now increasingly, safeguards don't tend to count for very much when a person has their back against the wall, when someone has something to gain. Unfortunately, I have seen a lot of safeguards just thrown out of the window when it's inconvenient. So I would be very wary of assuming that women are as protected as they maybe think they are. There's no protection against a broken heart. And in many of these situations, even if they are resolved, someone is usually the loser. Someone usually ends up getting hurt. And that is before we even look at the child and what can happen to a child in these situations. It's difficult to avoid situations where a child may become completely abandoned as a result of a surrogacy arrangement. In commercial surrogacy, in any form of surrogacy for that matter, a child can have up to 5 parents. Think about it, they can have the commissioning parents, the egg donor, the sperm donor, the surrogate. In a flash, they can end up with no parents. There was a case involving a Japanese couple, and this is a situation that has been replayed in many scenarios, where a couple commissioned a surrogate, they then divorced. So they stepped away from the surrogacy agreement. The egg donor and sperm donor may not have even been traceable because of anonymous donation. And even if they were traceable, they had certainly not signed up to look after a child. They would have signed away those rights. The surrogate had also signed away her rights to the child. So the child had nobody. And it opens a massive can of worms, because the Convention on the Rights of the Child says that a child has a right to a nationality from birth. But nationality comes through a parent, usually through the mother. So if we can't even be sure who a child's mother is, how can we say that child has a nationality? You know, a child can end up in complete legal limbo, parentless and stateless. And this is not a situation we want anyone to be born into.
No, I don't. How do you even begin to address that? You know, baby is born, and then who takes hold of that child? Who takes responsibility?
Exactly. And I think that really what we're seeing is that commercial surrogacy is throwing up questions that no one could have considered, no one could have foreseen when IVF first happened, when Louise Brown was born, opening up this ART revolution. No one could have foreseen how complex it was going to get, and the voices that were rallying against it were not taken seriously. But we have now situations that really strike at the heart of what it means to be human. What does it mean to be a child, to be somebody's child? What is your place in the world if you don't know who your parents are? What's a mother? What's a father? What do we understand by family? I have a friend who was conceived as a result of anonymous sperm donation. Her mother had artificial insemination. She knows who her mother is. She's no idea who her father was. Her daughter has a terrible congenital illness. She has no way of knowing whether that was inherited from her father, where that came from. There are so many questions like that arising. It will have affected that child's treatment, that they could not get a family history. None of these questions were considered way back when IVF was first starting, but we have to consider them now.
Absolutely. So one of the things that you argue in the book is that both abortion and surrogacy render one of the two human lives in pregnancy expendable. Could you flesh that out a little bit?
What I mean by that is that with abortion, the baby's life is entirely expendable. In a nutshell, the baby's value is entirely down to choice. Every child a wanted child, or every unwanted child a dead child, depending on which way you see it. So we've created a culture in which the value of an unborn child is completely based upon another person's desires, not the inherent value of that human life. So it's hardly surprising that in surrogacy, the tables can completely turn. We have had cases of surrogates dying in the process of giving birth to someone else's child because the woman's health and well-being were regarded as really quite secondary to that of the child she was carrying. There was a case I cite in my book of a young Indian surrogate, Premila Baghela, who died almost certainly preventably at 8 months pregnancy, and an Indian newspaper rather bitterly remarked, "Oh, it was okay, she did her job. Yeah, the American couple got their baby, that's all right." And now that's an extreme situation, but in any case involving commercial surrogacy, the principal concern is the safe delivery of the goods,
Right.
not the health, the physical, mental safety, the human rights of the surrogate mother. As far as I know, no one is looking at what happens to a surrogate mother after she has given up that baby. You know, does she have postnatal depression? Does it affect her relationships with her family? That woman's life becomes expendable.
Yeah. And you already touched on this a little bit, but is there any more to say about how surrogacy violates the rights of children?
I think we've touched on most of the issues, but I suppose well, I think we need to talk about this a little bit more. I think this is a rather dark subject, but with commercial surrogacy in countries that are not so well regulated, there are all sorts of issues surrounding what happens to children, not just when a commissioning parent decides not to claim the child, but also cases of children being created very deliberately for the black market. There was a documentary some years ago about the black market in surplus surrogate children. In some cases, commissioning parents will be told, oh, the surrogate is carrying a singleton baby. In fact, the surrogate is carrying twins. The commissioning parents will be given their singleton baby and will go home not knowing that there was a twin brother or sister who then disappears into the criminal underworld. The prospects are so appalling, it's almost impossible to even talk about. But even when a baby is very much loved and wanted and is taken home by a loving couple, there tends to be an assumption that that child is very blessed because there can be no greater show of love to a child than showering quite that much money and energy on creating that baby. But surely that completely misunderstands what love even means. Perhaps unintentionally, that argument presupposes that a child is a product and has a price tag, and that he should be very grateful for having been bought at a very high price, but it is still treating a child as a commodity.
That's right. That's right. And there's has to be, if not yet documented in literature, there has to be some kind of psychological effect from just knowing that you were created in this way and bought and purchased for this amount. That has to affect somebody.
Yes, and there have been studies done on psychological studies on children born through surrogacy arrangements, because obviously adoption has always happened. You know, for centuries, there have always been thousands of children who have been brought up by people who are not their birth parents for all sorts of reasons. And as a result of that, we have a lot of data. There have been a lot of studies done about adopted children and how well they fare in that situation, and whether they are in any way psychologically harmed by being separated from the biological parent. And these days, for that reason, we are quite wary of separating mother and baby unless it's absolutely necessary. However, it's only, of course, very recently that surrogacy has even been an issue. And what is being seen is that whereas we can look very far back at the issue of the biological link and breaking the biological link, what we're now seeing is there is such thing as a gestational link. And that this doesn't just affect the mother. The baby bonds with the mother in the womb, even if there is no biological connection. If the egg and the sperm have come from complete strangers, there is still a connection. And there are fears about what happens when you break that gestational connection. But this is because it's something that has only happened in recent decades. It's a very new field. But we may be storing up a lot of problems for ourselves and for children in that position, you know, when the truth of the matter comes out. What we really have created through surrogacy is a massive and really very dangerous social engineering experiment. We don't really know. The mothers and the babies are the subjects. We don't really know what the eventual outcome will be.
No, we don't. We don't. And what we do know is not great. and like you said, with adoption, that is different than surrogacy, because adoption is, we have this child that exists that needs a family. We have a family that wants to, give of themselves to a child who has a need, an existing child who has a need. That's really different than creating a child from the outset intentionally to say, we're aware of these risks, we're aware of these complications, but we're going to subject you to this anyway without your consent, because you don't exist yet. This is just who you're going to be, and we're going to create you that way because we want to.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a huge moral difference. And I think there's a need really to try to perhaps end on a slightly more positive note. I think we don't take lightly. I mean, there was a time when, in fact, forced adoption happened quite frequently, where babies were taken away, particularly from very young mothers. It was just assumed they weren't in a position to raise a child. Better for this child to be with a respectable couple. And there were heartbreaking cases like that that are still coming to light now. I think we do not take lightly placing a child for adoption. I don't think any woman takes lightly placing her baby for adoption. It's a huge and sometimes very courageous decision to make. And I do think that looking beyond ART and surrogacy and everything that's going on in that field, there is a need to have a brave conversation about adoption itself. The irony was not lost on me that when India was at the height of its fertility tourism bubble, there were 12 million orphans in India looking for homes. And I do think we need to think about this a lot more. We need to have more of a conversation about the benefits of adoption, about really considering whether there need to be significant changes made to adoption policy in our own countries to make it easier for adoptive couples, whilst at the same time maintaining those guidelines, those regulations to ensure the safety of the child. I know so many people who have adopted a child or children, but they have been really forced to run a gauntlet to get there. I really believe our world is rich enough that no child should be left to grow up without a loving family, and no childless couple should be unable to establish a family of their own through entirely ethical and loving means.
Absolutely. Amen. Is there anything else that we haven't discussed that you think listeners should know?
I think with this incredibly emotive subject, I suppose I would say to listeners, we need to make sure we're not carried away by the spin that is placed on by the media on this subject. I think this will be seen as a very dark chapter in our history one day. I would also like to make listeners aware of alternatives to ART. I've mentioned NAPRO technology. I'm more than aware that the pain of infertility is very, very hard and very real for couples who are struggling to come to terms with childlessness. I know that it is very, very difficult. However, there are possibilities there. And with NAPRO technology, it offers a couple the possibility of ethical and holistic fertility treatment, but it also helps a couple to deal with not having a child, if that's the way it works out. It's not just about trying to create a product, it's a very loving alternative to ART, which strengthens relationships and helps couples emotionally as well as physically. So I really would advise listeners just to look more into NAPRO technology and those alternatives.
Beautiful. Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving of yourself, for being here today and sharing your wisdom and all of that. Where can listeners find you, find your work?
I've got an author page on the Ignatius Press website as both Fiorella Nash and Fiorella de Maria. I write my fiction under my maiden name, and you can also get my books, if not directly from the publisher, from Amazon, from any bookstore. So do look me up.
Beautiful. I wish we had time to dive into all of your fiction as well, but that will have to be a mystery for another time.
Definitely.
Have a great day. Thank you so much.
You too. Thank you.